Okay, so slope-intercept form. Today what we're learning about is slope-intercept form. Okay, what is slope-intercept form? Slope-intercept form is when the equation is written like this, when it's solved for y. Solve for y, the x term first, the constant next. It's in this format of y equals mx plus b. M being the slope of the line, and b meaning the y-intercept of the line. Okay? When it's in slope-intercept form, we can easily identify what is the slope and what is the y-intercept. Okay? That's the cool thing about this format. This format also makes it super duper easy to graph, okay, our line. How many of you, raise your hand if you've learned about this format before? Slope-intercept form, it looks familiar. Okay, cool. All right, so we're going to do from our notes page that you guys have, we're going to do 2 examples together from this part, and then we're going to save these ones for the warm-up tomorrow, okay? All right, so we're going to take a look at number 2 and number 4, okay? So on number 2, I'm going to rewrite mine up here so I have a little bit more room to work with it, okay? But what it's asking us to do in these is it wants us to convert these into slope-intercept form, because it wants to know what is the slope and what is the y-intercept. So if I want to know the slope and the y-intercept of my line, an easy way to do that is if it's not written in slope-intercept, to write it that way. And then I can easily identify those things by looking at it, looking at the number in front of the x and the number after the x to tell me what is the slope, what is the y-intercept. Okay? So if I were looking at this equation right here, I've rewritten it here so I have some more room to work with it. Okay? I want to solve it for y in order to put it into slope-intercept form. So whenever it says write the equation of the line in slope-intercept form, what we want to do is we want to solve for y. Okay? Solving for y will allow us to view it in that format. Okay? So look at this equation here. What's wrong? I don't have y by itself here, so what do I need to get rid of first? The 2x, okay? The 2x is positive. Let me subtract it by itself. That will make 0 on that side, right? Now I'm going to also have to subtract it from the opposite side. Okay, so when I do that, I get negative 3y. Don't forget this was a negative here. Okay, equals. Now which one of these am I going to write down first if I want it to be in slope-intercept form? Well, look at the way slope-intercept form looks. Which one comes first, the x term or the constant? The x. So when I rewrite this, I'm going to write negative 2x. And what kind of 9 was that? Positive 9. So plus 9. Okay? Does that make sense how we got that right there? Okay. All right. So from there, now we're going to go ahead and we're going to continue solving for y. So how do I get rid of this negative 3? What's it doing with the y? It's multiplying with y, right? So what's the opposite of multiplying? Dividing. Okay, so let's divide by negative 3. Now, if I do it to this side, I have to do it to this whole other side, which means to all the parts, right? Okay, so now I'm going to go ahead and that makes 1. Okay, so now I'm going to reduce some of these things on this side over here. So what's a negative divided by a negative? A positive. Now, can 3 go into 2 evenly? No, so I'm just going to write positive 2/3 x because that is reduced. Okay, what's positive 9 divided by negative 3? Negative 3. So I'm going to write minus 3 or negative 3 right there. Okay, so this is my final equation written in slope-intercept form. Y equals 2/3x minus 3. Okay. All right, so now after that, let's identify what is your slope. So when I'm looking at the slope, remember, is the number that's multiplying by x. So what number is multiplying by x? 2/3. So your slope, m, equals 2/3. Okay? Now, the y-intercept, remember this is the number adding or subtracting with the x term. So I have minus 3 or negative 3 there, so that is my y-intercept. Okay? Are there questions on this one, on how we did that? Okay, do you guys need a second to catch up?
Yes.
Yeah? Okay. I'll give you a second to catch up. Okay. So, if you're caught up, let's go ahead and rewrite this one over off to the side so we have some more room to work with it. Okay? It wants us to take this, write it in slope-intercept form. So remember, that means solve for y. So what do I need to do to both sides to get rid of this 3x? Well, divide or subtract. I heard someone say divide, but is this 3x multiplying by 2y? No. Okay, so we're going to subtract it to get rid of itself, right? Okay, so now when I subtract it, that makes 0. And then over here on this side, what kind of x do I have left? Negative 1. Now, do I really need to write the negative 1? I mean, we can if you guys want to. Do you want to write it, or do you just want to write negative x? Negative x? Okay. So negative x. And then let's bring down this positive 8 that we had here. Okay, now, what else do we still need to do to isolate y? Yeah, divide all the parts by 2, right? Divide this one, divide this one, divide this one. Okay? So now, let's go ahead and write it, and let's think about what I really have here. Okay, what is your slope that you really have? What's really in the numerator? 1. What's in the denominator? 2. So I can write that like this, negative 1/2, because that's my slope, times x, and then what does this make? Plus 4, right? Does that make sense how I got this negative 1/2? Okay? And the reason why I'm not keeping it written like this is because I want, slope-intercept form allows me to easily see what the slope is, right? So if I write it like this, it's not so easy, but if I write it like this, that makes it a little bit easier to see what that slope is, okay? So now, let's go ahead and write my final equation, y equals negative 1/2 x plus 4, okay? And what is your slope? Well, remember, your slope is the number in front of the x. So what is the number in front of the x? Negative 1/2. It's that whole fraction, right? Okay, now, what's your y-intercept? Well, remember, your y-intercept is the number adding or subtracting with the x term. So what number is that? 4. So your b, your y-intercept, equals positive 4. Okay. Are there questions on what we did there? Okay, Danny?
So when we have annex as a numerator, we can pass it, we can convert it into a 1.
Yeah, if you do not have a number in front of the x up here, then the numerator is really a 1. Okay, because you have 1x. Does that make sense? And in this case, it's actually negative 1. Yeah? Okay. All right. Okay, let's move on to our next couple examples. Okay, in these next few examples, we're going to be graphing, okay, each line. It's already given you the equation of each line in slope-intercept form, okay? So when we graph using slope-intercept form, we want to identify first what's our slope. So here's your slope, right? You also want to identify what's your y-intercept. Well, here's your y-intercept, okay? Now, where do we start? We always start with the y-intercept, okay? The y-intercept is like your starting point. It tells you where to put your first point on the graph, okay? So if I'm starting with the y-intercept here, okay, with the y-intercept's at positive 4 on the y-axis. So go to your y-axis and find where positive 4 is. Positive 4 is right here. Put a point there. I know there's a point there because that is where my line crosses the y-axis. That's why it's called the y-intercept. Okay, now, from that point, we're going to use this slope to help us find some more points on our line. Okay? Now, this slope says -3 is our slope, but when I'm thinking about having a rise and a run, right now I don't see what number my run is. Is my run 0? Is there really a 0 in the bottom here? What's my run? 1. So put 1 in your denominator. So now we can see that this number here is your rise of your slope, and this number here is your run. Okay? So from this point, I'm going to follow this slope. This slope tells me where the next points go. So I'm going to rise -3. Well, that means go down 1, 2, 3, straight down. Now run 1. So I'm going to move to the right 1 and put a point there. Now from this new point, I'm going to do this pattern again. So down 1, 2, 3, to the right 1. And I'm going to do that pattern again. Down 1, 2, 3, to the right 1. I'm going to fit as many points as I can onto my graph. Okay? So now that I've fit all those points, what do I get to do with them? Connect them. Okay? If it does not tell me that my domain is a specific set of values, then I'm going to assume my domain is all real numbers, so I'm going to go ahead and connect these. Okay? All right, so there's your line. Okay, are there questions on how we did that one? No? Okay. All right, does everyone understand why we go down and to the right? Down and to the right, down and to the right. Because when we're dealing with our slope, which way do we go? From left to right. Okay? Remember the Slope Dude video that you guys watched? Which way does Slope Dude ski? From left to right. So from left to right, he needs to be going downhill because this is a negative slope, right? So he goes down and over, down and over, down and over. Does that make sense? Remember, downhill, nice negative. Do you guys remember that? Okay? So that's why we're moving to the right. Okay? What would happen if I messed up and I did down and to the left? Down and to the left. What would happen with my line? Would it be going downhill or would it be going uphill? It would be going uphill. Okay? So that's why when you're plotting your points using your slope, you always need to move to the right. You need to be consistent. Okay? All right. Let's take a look at the next example. Okay? So identify your slope. Here's your slope. Let's identify your y-intercept. Okay, your y-intercept's -1. Okay, which one am I going to start with? -1, the y-intercept. So on your graph, on the y-axis, find where -1 is. Where's -1? Right there. Everyone put a point right there. Okay, now, keep your pencil on this point. Okay? What is your slope telling you to do? Well, let's think about what your slope says. It says +5/6. So this means your rise is 5 and your run is 6, right? So if it's positive, which way do I go? Up or down? Up. So let's go up 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then run 6. Now remember, which way are we going to run? To the right. Okay? So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Okay, now go ahead and take your ruler and connect those dots. Okay, that gives us an idea of what our line's doing. All right, how does this feel so far? Hard or easy? Easy? Okay. All right. Okay, let's take a look at some of the questions that we have down here. Okay. Did you guys have enough time? Did everyone get this? Okay. I can move the paper up a little bit. Okay. All right, so let's take a look at problem 7. It says, what are the slope and the y-intercept of the line y equals 3x minus 5? Okay, so all you're doing is having to say, what is the slope and what's the y-intercept? So what's the slope here? Look at the number in front of x. What number is in front of x? Okay, now, are you going to write down for your slope 3x? Is x part of the slope? X is part of the slope? No. X is not part of the slope. X is the variable, okay? So, the only thing that you write down for the slope is the number, not the x. Okay? All right, next. What is your y-intercept here?
5.
Now, be careful. Make sure you include the sign with it. So what sign is with it?
Negative.
Negative 5. Okay? All right. Okay. Let's take a look at number 8. Okay, on number 8, it says a line has a y-intercept of negative 11 and a slope of 0.25. Write its equation in slope-intercept form. Now, typically when I have equations and they're in slope-intercept form, I don't usually see decimals, okay? And they gave me a decimal here for the slope, right? So what could I do with that decimal? Can I turn it into a fraction?
Yes.
What is that decimal equivalent to? 1/4. Okay, so let's write the equation of my line using, instead of 0.25, let's use 1/4. Okay, so our equation of our line, y equals m. M is the slope. What do we say the slope was? 1/4 times x plus b. Well, b is a negative, so am I really going to write plus 11? What am I going to write down? Minus, because it's a negative for my y-intercept. Okay, so there's the equation of my line. Okay, are there questions on that one? Okay, all right, let's take a look at the last one here. Okay, the last one says a tank can hold 30,000 gallons of water. If 500 gallons of water are used each day, write the equation that represents the amount of water in the tank X days after it's full. Okay, so you need to think of your y-intercept when we're graphing is like our starting point, right? Okay, when we're dealing with word problems, rather than being like a starting point, it can also be a starting amount, the amount we start with, okay? The slope is the rise over run, which remember is the vertical change compared to the horizontal change, right? But when we're dealing with word problems, we're just saying that the slope is the change that's happening, okay? So the first thing I want to do is I want to identify in this word problem, what is my starting point or what is my starting amount? Okay, and then what is my slope? What's the change that's happening? So let's reread the word problem again. A tank can hold 30,000 gallons of water. If 500 gallons of water are used each day, write the equation that represents the amount of water in the tank X days after it is full. How much water is this tank starting out with?
30,000.
30,000, okay? So this is going to be your y-intercept. 30,000 gallons of water, right? So let's say that our B equals 30,000. Does that make sense why we picked that? Okay, now how much is that changing? It's changing by how much? 500 per day, right? Okay, so it's changing by 500 per day. So our slope is going to be 500. Now, let me ask you guys, is it increasing by 500 or is it decreasing? If they're using the water from the tank, that means it's what? Decreasing, right? So is this slope going to be positive or negative? Well, if it's decreasing the amount,
Net.
yeah, it's going down 500 each day. Does that make sense there? Okay, so now that we have our slope and our y-intercept, let's go ahead and write the equation of this line. We're going to use x as one of our variables, and then we can also use y, since we're already talking about the y-intercept, right? So, y equals m. What is m?
And slope.
Negative 500 x plus b. What is b?
And y-intercept.
Yeah, the y-intercept 30,000, right? So here's your equation of your line in slope-intercept form. Okay? Does that make sense there, how we figured that one out?
Yes.
Okay. All right, are there questions so far on what we did here? Okay.